Hey, this is Ryan here at Plague Scythe Studios, and welcome everyone to the grand finale of my recent pod obsession. This is basically the Infinity War of Line 6 gear, and just like Infinity War, you can expect a casualty or two along the way. What we're doing today is taking three separate generations of pods, specifically desktop pod kidney-shaped beans, and putting them through what I consider to be the ultimate test for anyone that's interested in either revisiting this kind of tech or maybe buying one used, especially if you're just now getting started, and a lot of this kind of stuff is budget oriented nowadays anyway. We'll be looking at pretty much every major aspect and use case of these units, ranging from clean to high gain tones, modulation effects, echo effects, even pairing them with outboard gear in both a live and recording scenario. So even though we're recording and demoing only three products today, this will actually represent a more holistic view on Line 6's product lineup for each generation. So my picks are the Line 6 Pod 2.0, the Line 6 Pod X3, and then of course the Line 6 Pod HD. Now, for reasons of time, money, efficiency, and everything else one sensible person could come up with, I'm not going to be demoing every bean ever released. I'm not going to go out and buy every floorboard ever released, especially not the Pro units and whatever other monstrosities they've came up with that share pod technology, because it's simply not necessary. Going down the pod timeline, you'll find there's really only three generations to compare, starting with the original and 2.0. That may sound like a sequel, but it's really just a firmware update. And specifically the 2.3 firmware, which we're running on this original pod, is the best of the best for this generation. It added a few more amp models. It cleans up some of the tube modeling tech, some of the cabinet models going on, and this, for the most part, still sounds like an original 1.0, just kind of sanitized in some ways. Because of that, this also shares the same sounds of the Pod Pro when upgraded to firmware 1.3. It actually doesn't sound all that different from 1.1 and 1.2 for my ears, as well as the floor pods and the pocket pod. So if you have any of those products, or you're looking at any of those products, this guy will represent the tones you can get out of those. Moving on to the next generation, we have the Pod X. I refrained from putting another letter at the end of that because there's technically two separate families of the Pod X's, the XT and the X3. Now you will find some minor firmware tweaks here and there. In my direct comparisons, they sound basically identical, even closer than a 1.0 and 2.0 pod would. The major difference between the two is DSP power. So on an X3, you can actually run two separate signal chains, whereas on the XT, you're stuck with one preset. So here you can do anything from stereo signal chains or combine multiple amp sounds, you name it. The other major advantage for the X3 is all the add-on models for effects and amplifiers are included out of the box on the X3, which gives us that much more leverage for comparison. And then finally, the last generation is, of course, the Pod HD. Luckily, there wasn't really any other revision of the kidney bean. There was a Pro X and HD 500X on the Pro and floorboard respectively, but once again, that was an increase in DSP power, a measly something like 20% at that, and all the models are shared across each one of them. Now, I don't own all of the HD amp packs because, frankly, I think they're a terrible value proposition, but I do own the high gain metal pack for some like-for-like comparisons with the X3, so we will have that. Now, this is another one of those head-to-head shootouts where equity and equality are very much at odds. With a relatively circuit like an overdrive, I can practically isolate every other variable in the signal chain. Same amp, same cab, same DI, and just say, all right, we're going to demo all these overdrives with level, max, drive at 0, tone at noon, then we'll do this setting, then we'll do this setting, then we'll do this setting. Can't really do the same thing with pods because, number one, they don't share the same amp models across each variation. They certainly don't share the same kind of basic algorithms or basic circuit design. And even with some of the things that I could isolate, like a chorus, I could technically run the same amp sound through each one of them, disable the internal modeling, and we could take a look at what the chorus sounds like by itself. It doesn't reflect reality because no one's going to do that. and you want to hear what these things are capable of doing on their own. So unless I specifically state otherwise, all the tones you're hearing will be coming from the pictured pod desktop and that alone. And in the interest of fairness, I dialed in all the presets you're hearing completely blind to the other ones, which means basically one day I grabbed the 2.0, I dialed in these presets, I got them to sound the way I liked, and then I didn't touch the rest of them. Then the next day I'd pick another one, and I didn't try to compare them to make them sound more like each other. I just got the preset that I found was the best that I could do out of these individual pods. So hopefully that will highlight the strengths and weaknesses and not necessarily dumb down one product to try to sound like the other one, and that sort of thing that sometimes happens when you try to do these things in a more equitable manner. Also worth noting is everything you're hearing, again, unless specifically stated otherwise, is coming out of the 1/4-inch line outs of each pod. I could technically run the other two as audio interfaces and reamp through that, but that is a completely digital signal chain, and again, in the sake of fairness, I wanted to eliminate that variable, or more accurately, introduce that variable to the other two. So these will be going through my Scarlett 6i6 preamps. You can't tell a difference anyway. It's all getting, number one, it's getting compressed on YouTube, but number two, these are extremely transparent preamps. They sound great, and there's, no real coloration going on. So everything you're hearing, it's pod. That's it. So with the experiment setup and testing methodology out of the way, let's get into some comparative shootouts. This first round will be relatively straightforward, just a simple single amp through a cabinet model sound. There'll be about 15% reverb mixed in from each pod. You'll barely even be able to hear it. It's really just to add some airiness since this is on the lower gain side of things. Specifically, there'll be a clean tone, American clean tone, powered by a Fender Blackface style amp, whichever fits that description most accurately across each pod. There'll be a edge of breakup sound, which will be kind of the JTM 45 Marshall bluesy sound. Again, whichever is closest. I'm pretty sure there's an exact JTM 45 model on all of these. And for the crunch sound, I'll use a typical Marshall Super Lead Plexi kind of model. Now, I actually restricted myself on all of these pods from changing the cabinet model. I'm going to give Line 6 the benefit of the doubt here and assume they picked the best sounding cab model for each amp head. That's not necessarily the case, but we're going to stick with that just to eliminate one other variable. Now, I did allow myself to change the microphone, though I think on most of these I end up sticking with something very similar. But I did that because you can't change mics per se on the Pod 2.0. You can change cab models, but they're oftentimes so different that I actually trust Line 6 to pick the best one for each one. So, you're going to be hearing like the Fender 2x12, you're going to be hearing Marshall Greenbacks, that kind of thing, but the microphone might change on the X3 and HD. Just keep an eye out for it in the description. So with that, let's have a listen. far as clean tones go, I could take any of those. Frankly, they're very serviceable. The 2.0 is a little too dark for my taste since there's no dedicated presence control, only a presence boost, and there's none of that power amp influence in its modeling like you get in some of the later generations. But a little bit of tweaking, I think that would be very usable. It still kind of sounds like a clean amp, so it gets a pass for me. The X3 is very processed sounding, and it's very finicky in the lower range, I find, from being too compressed sounding to being overbearing, and I don't think I hit that sweet spot. I don't think there was enough bass there in comparison to the other two, but it's a very nice processed kind of tone, and I could definitely see why the XTs and X3s were popular for those that maybe already had a high gain amp they were happy with but wanted something different that they couldn't do with that amp head in the clean stuff. And this is a great pick for that. It's no wonder this was so popular with the gent guys in the late 2000s. And though it's not my personal preference, I can give a pass to the X3 as well. My pick goes to the Pod HD. It walks a very fine line between a little too sanitized, but it still does sound fairly realistic. Not as organic or tubey sounding as some more contemporary modeling tech, but I can happily play through this, and I have quite a few times. So I think this goes to show that, capturing the sound of a clean amp is relatively simple compared to that of a high gain amp when even the 2.0 is not lagging that far behind from the HD. Things start to shift around a bit when we get to the breakup tones, and this is where the HD starts to sound a little nasally, and I blame that squarely on the cab models. I almost changed it. I almost broke my rule, but I held fast. I assumed again, that Line 6 had our best interests, but there was a couple other models that I thought were far better for the JTM amp. No microphone that I picked really solved that problem. So you can get a better breakup sound than I demonstrated here, but that's kind of what they advertise as being the right pick, and I don't necessarily agree. Although, as far as the tube response, as far as the amp goes, it's actually fairly serviceable. You get the opposite problem on the 2.0 where the cab model for this is fairly atrocious. I believe it's not this one, that's bypass. That one's line 6, 4x12. Believe it's this one. It's a greenback and it's just way too dark. It does not go with any amp model on this device in my opinion, and that one really killed it. Again, the amp modeling wasn't bad, but this is where some of that boxiness starts to come out, and it has a sound of its own, but if you're looking for an authentic, bluesy style overdrive, I would personally pick another amp model than the JTM on there. My actual pick goes to the X3 for this one, surprisingly enough, because I generally don't like the crunch and lower gain stuff on the X models, but this hit the EQ just kind of perfectly for me. It's a fat mid-range. It's not, too boomy. It's not too nasally. Good work on this one. The tide turns once again in the favor of the HD with the crunch tones, though, and I found this to be a damn near perfect representation of what I think a plexi sound should be. It had that no nonsense, you can't screw it up Marshall tone stack where no matter where you put it, it sounded pretty good, but cranking all the controls, dialing bass back a little bit, it had the tone. It didn't have quite as much upper mid saturation as maybe I'd want for a mix ready sound, but I think if I dialed up the master volume a bit more, it would have smoothed out. And yeah, overall it did the thing that I was looking for. Now, when it comes to the X3, this one, I could not save the Plexi model on here to save my life. So extremely thin by comparison. No microphone would save that either. And it was kind of a fight to get it to be beefy in the low end without being completely thin and without being overbearing and too chunky, which definitely happens on those old Plexi models. And where you don't have a master volume control, it's just kind of a channel volume. There's no help in terms of smoothing it out, so you'll have to post EQ the hell out of it. So not a fan on this one. And again, the Pod 2.0 suffers from what I feel is a poor choice in cab models. The Plexi actually doesn't sound that bad if you put it on the Vintage 30 Marshall over here, I think. And there's even some 4x10 options that I think sounds pretty good. So this one got screwed over by Line 6, I think, in choosing that one. If, again, you do some post EQ work in your audio workstation, if you want to record with this for some reason, it can be saved. But I would definitely recommend playing around with the cabinets. The response, though, in terms of the amplifier, pretty commendable. So again, throw a little clean boost on it, drive about here, knock bass back, crank middle and treble, and it does the plexi thing, which is pretty cool. So the HD is in a pretty considerable lead, as you would hope. It is the newest one. At the same time, though, I think what's holding back each one of these products the most when they lose is the stock cab model that gets paired with the amp. So I highly recommend playing around with different cab models. I think each one of these amps are just shown. They may not be perfect representations of the real thing that they're trying to simulate, but they get you in the ballpark, and that's not the bottleneck. It's the chosen cab. So like I said, the 2.0, try out the V30s, try out the vintage 70s, try out the numerous models and mics that you have on the X3 and HD. You'll probably find something that works better than what's chosen for you when it comes to those kind of middle of the road sounds. Cleans are cleans. They're pretty good. Now, let's get to the test that starts to separate the boys from the men, high gain. Now, this one's weird because this is where we start having to separate each different unit. See, this only has really 2 high gain amps, technically 3 if you count the JCM 800, but we'll get to that tone later in the video. We have the rectified and modern high gain. There's actually 2 models of each of those, so technically 4. We're going to be looking at the stock 2 here, which obviously is a rectifier, and the modern high gain is a Soldano preamp. That's pretty much it. Now with the X3, you have a bucket load, including the likes of a 5150, an Uberschall, an Engel, custom amps, and you simply can't do a fair comparison with the Pod 2.0. So we're not. We're just going to show what each one of them can do. Similarly, there are some amps on the HD that mirror those, although I did have to buy some of those with a metal pack. So the 5150 and the Big Bottom did not come stock on here. You have to pay extra for that, which is bullshit, but that's the way it is. So we'll be demoing the amps that are like for like across each model, as well as the ones that are only on the X3 and HD. Oddly enough, I freaking love the rectifier model on the 2.0. It doesn't really sound all that much like a rectifier, let's be real. The EQ controls don't respond like it does. It does not do the whole cascading thing where the treble kind of controls the output volume a little bit, and the middle is almost like a tilt EQ, and it's not the same thing. The technology was not at that point, but it does a great heavy metal guitar tone. It's a little too dark, again, for my preference. They were limited by the modeling technology of the time, but it is a sound that I've yet to be able to reproduce with anything else, plugins, real amps, or not. It's basically early 2000s Fear Factory and Meshuggah in a box. What else do you want? So it's a cool tone, and I actually dig it. The modern high gain Soldano, kind of a similar thing. I don't like it quite as much for rhythm, but it does work, and it's a great lead sound, especially one that is very pronounced in the mids. You can't really go too wrong with the tone stack on here as well. I just give it enough low end and crank treble, I think, and mids to taste, and you're done. It's actually a pretty decent sound. It also does the similar thing where noon on drive is about perfect. Too much, it gets too saturated. Too little, it's a little thin, but it definitely has the insane gain structure of a Soldano amp. I personally prefer to boost either one of these with an external stomp box, since this doesn't have stomp box modeling. But for the sake of that demo, I didn't boost it at all, and it still does work. Now, we get to the other two. I think they fell apart a little bit. I think the Soldano models on the X3 particularly suck. It goes from not enough gain, completely anemic, to mush in basically no time. That's not what the real amp does at all. The post EQ, everything else sits in the mix better, but it's not a fun or inspiring amp model to play through. The rectifier does sound more like a rectifier, but it sounds more like the 3 channels to me, which are not my favorite models, but they do work. It's a very usable rectifier sound, but I think the other expansion amps that are on board are better for high gain, and I would use the rectifier here for more like a grunge sound, more so than like a scooped out metal thing. So it works, but this was actually my least favorite pick for those amps. The HD kind of lies somewhere in between. I think the rectifier's pretty good on this one. I use it as the foremost metal amp. It better be pretty good, considering that in the Engel Fireball and the Bogner are the only ones that come stock on here, which is garbage. But the Soldano's pretty good as well. It sounds far more accurate and behaves more accurately. The tone stack hardly does anything, but I still really like the 2.0 personally. I wouldn't give it points for accuracy, but in terms of just a cool sound, that's the one I like. Now, if I was going to pick a rhythm tone, I'd go with the HD. Now we get to the other amps, which, of course, the 2.0 takes a big fat L on because it doesn't have them. For whatever reason, the X3 absolutely wiped the floor with the HD on the Uberschall models. I don't know what they did to screw them up here. It turned into an inarticulate, mushy mess by comparison to what this sounded like. Not 100% accurate to how the Uberschall behaves, but I don't care because it sounds great. And this neither does the cool, djenty, modern metal sound, nor sounds as authentic as like the Axe-Fx Uber. So I don't ever use the Uberschall on the HD. I don't think it's that great. Things start to change a bit with the Engel amps. I think the final revision of the Engel Fireball on here, once they updated the firmware, is one of the best amps on HD. The Powerball on here, it's okay. Would not be my first pick. If you are an absolute Engel fanatic, then at least you have one to pick from, but it's nothing special in my opinion. Now, if you don't spend the extra $35 to $50, depending on any sales that's going on at that time, you won't even have access to these next two amps we're talking about on the HD, which automatically gives this thing quite the advantage. So the 5150, kind of a wash. I personally think it sort of sucks on the HD. It does react the way it should, so the drive definitely works how you would expect on a 5150, where kind of that noon to 1 o'clock region is perfect for most 6 strings. If you play aggressively, you don't even need an overdrive pedal. The tone stack kind of behaves very similarly, a little bit more authentically than the X3 does. I still think the 5150 model on here overall sounds better, and if you could have paired this with the HD cabs, it would have been, I think, the best 5150 sound out of the lot. But what I can safely say is I don't recommend buying the metal pack for the 5150 if you're interested in that. This has a better 5150 sound, and you can get plenty of free VSTs of the 5150 and 6505 that sound way better than both of these. Now, the next one is perhaps my very favorite high gain amp model across any of the pods, and that's the Big Bottom. And that it's just a gent machine. That's what it's for. It's basically the nothing Catch 33 and Obzen sound. from Meshuggah, and it's a rectifier paired with, I think, like a 1x15 sub cabinet that's mixed in somehow. It's cool. And in a weird move, I think I'm going to have to give the victory to the X3 again on this one. Number one, on the grounds that this is included right out of the box on the X3. But second, they didn't really do anything with it when they brought it over to the HD. There's no power amp modeling, nothing like that you can tweak. It does pair pretty well with the onboard cabinets, particularly the 30s that they pair it with. The XL V30 cab is just far too bass heavy, but there is an artificial quality to it that I think is an advantage on the X3. It does have a sound that is hard to replicate anywhere else. It's just that, like, first animals as leaders tone built in, ready to go. So I really like it, and I like how it pairs with the other gear, the other virtual gear, as it were, on the X3. So as far as high gain goes, it's a bit of a wash, and it's really going to depend on what subgenres of rock and metal that you play. I think for the processed mid to late 2000s kind of sounds, the X3 excels. For everything else, the HD is probably the better pick, although they do backslide on some of the amp models, in my opinion. And the 2.0 at this point is a kind of a novelty when it comes to high gain, but it does sound cool. And, you know, at the time, everyone loved it. So there is something to be said about the tech that was out in 1998 and early 2000s. Now we move on to modulation effects. And this is another instance where what effects we're looking at is a bit limited by the 2.0. Fortunately, these are the only effects I personally use anyway, so it doesn't even matter, and even one of them's pushing it. So we're going to listen to chorus and flanger models, which are limited to chorus 1 and 2 and flanger 1 and 2 on the pod. You got quite a few more models on the HD and X3 that we'll take a listen to, as well as other things like ring modulators and all this crap that I never touch, so I'm not going to look at it. All the sounds you're hearing will be once again coming specifically from each device, so you're not just hearing the chorus or just the flanger, you're hearing a tone that was built using this, but it does center around that. I did try to make them a bit closer sounding. There's still differences, obviously, but there's ones that I don't think was, out of the realm of possibility of getting, dialed in blind. So with that, modulation. That's a pretty wide-ranging definition of chorus and flanger, ain't it? So for the 2.0, the chorus models are really just variations of the same sort of sound. I think one of them's a sine wave, one of them's a triangle wave. Maybe it's a square, but I could be wrong either way. But in general, I find these more useful as a stereo widening effect more than like a traditional wavy, wobbly chorus sound. So they're good for cleans. They're really good for leads when the effect is subtle. They can get a little wobbly if you turn the speed up, but that's not really what they're good for. But that's pretty much all this does. So if that kind of stereo chorus sound isn't your thing, then you'll probably hate what's on the Pod 2.0. But that's probably my second favorite kind of sound. So I actually really like what's on here. It is just harder to adjust, and there's actually a few things that you're locked out of if you don't have this thing hooked up via MIDI, which who the hell's going to do that besides some dork like me? So, you don't have as much tweakability. When you get to the other models, they kind of trade blows again. So for the X3, I think this one wins overall because the dimension model is just great. It is fairly accurate to what a real Roland or Boss Dimension pedal would sound like. It does have the different switches you can enable. You can actually enable multiple of them at the same time. I feel the dimension's not nearly as good on here. I don't know which model they were, switching to, if this was based on a rack unit, this was based on the pedal, or vice versa, but something changed and it's not as good. It's not as deep. It's more wobbly, cheap sounding on the HD, I think. The stereo sine and square wave choruses on the X3 are really nice, and you can dial them anywhere from that subtle widening effect to a complete wobble fest if you're into that. Whereas the HD, I think the closest thing was really the analog stereo, and it wasn't as good, in my opinion, at least not for the kind of chorus sound that I'm going for. And then the tri-chorus, which I usually love, for example, on like the Boss MD500, that tri-chorus sound is epic. Axe Effects has one as well that's also great, extremely tweakable. Not a fan on this thing, especially their default settings are atrocious. Even tweaked, I was not really all that crazy about it. So I end up sticking with a very subtle dimension setting almost all the time if I'm going for a chorus sound on this, and even then I really don't like it as much as the X3. So for a no-brainer, just turn a chorus sound on, the 2.0 is great, but I prefer the X3 for the overall chorus experience. However, these two once again trade blows on the flanger aspect of things. I think the flangers on the X3 are extremely tacky sounding. They sound like they came out of one of my cheap multi-effects units when I first started playing guitar that was worth, $30 from a pawn shop. The HD, on the other hand, has that more authentic sound that you associate with vintage pedals or rack units. It's got that jet takeoff kind of swoop sound that, that's a flanger in my book. And they were much more tweakable. They actually did things when you did change the controls for the better rather than just different, which is what I found in the X3. And then the 2.0, very commendable for the time, actually. I think they're okay. I mean, if I were playing in a cover band around the time that this thing was new, I'd have no qualms about using the flanger on here for a song or two. One of these I definitely prefer over the other ones. I can't remember which is which right now, but it's all right. And if you could more easily adjust some of the effects like, rise time or the depth or whatever, then this would be a real winner. But overall, HD number 1, 2.0 number 2, and X3 number 3. Ha! Finally happened. Now for our final pair of effect-centric shootouts, echo, more specifically delay and reverb. So this is another one where your selection's very limited on 2.0, but that's not going to stop us on the X3 and HD from taking a look at some more of those models. So in terms of delay, you got one. It's a delay. It's kind of stereo, kind of not. You can change some more parameters by changing holding down tap tempo, change the mix, you can change the feedback, some stuff with effect tweak. That's pretty much it. Reverb, you have two models. You can change the decay by, once again, holding down tap tempo and the overall mix of the reverb. You've got a room model and a spring model, both of which are automatically selected based on which amp model you choose. However, for this test, I manually changed them via MIDI and kept with the same clean sound. That way you could, discern what was the reverb change and what was the amp change. And then for the other models, we'll be taking a look at far more reverb and delay effects. So, echo. Here we go. Delay is another effect where I don't think any of these pods really fail at. Line 6 is pretty at home when it comes to these sort of time-based effects, and it shows. The HD, I think, barely edges out the X3 because it does have a modulation delay. I could take it or leave it. I like chorus through delay better, but if you like a clean guitar tone with some modulated delays over top of it, then the HD will be your pick. Otherwise, both the stereo models, or for both models, all the stereo models sounded really nice. I could take any of them. All of them had the parameters that I would want to adjust. Very good stuff. The 2.0 is again in that scenario where if I was in a cover band, I'd use it, it'd be fine, but it's not my preferable kind of stereo delay where you've got the mix between feedback and delay time trade-off on the left and right channel. It's not the ping pong delay I really like. It's more center channel focus. It doesn't have the width, the depth that I like, but it is usable. So for this one, kind of a wash between the HD and X3. They're both really good. This one definitely second place, but I wouldn't say it's so bad that it's dead bottom. I think these two tie for first, and this one's just, it's usable. It's all right. So pretty good job on the delay side of things for line 6. That brings us to reverb, and I really like the reverbs on here. They're not super authentic sounding again, but if you're going for a very airy, open, kind of pushing on ambient guitar tone, they sound pretty good. Even the spring, it definitely does the drip thing. And the room I think it's dynamic enough that it can go from a simple, little room reverb like you're hearing now, because I don't have this freaking room treated, to a full-blown kind of concert hall sound. So I'm actually really impressed with this. I don't know what they did on the XT and X3 generations, but I can never get the reverbs to sound as good as on the originals, no matter what model, no matter what mix. It's kind of dead sounding by comparison. It's fine when you listen to it on its own. It's good, and you are probably going to be happy enough with it. But when you compare it, like, oh wow, you're missing something. And I think the spring reverb models are more accurate, compared to some of the high frequency content that you get on the 2.0, but it's not necessarily as good sounding, so I don't particularly care. The HD, I think, definitely strikes the right balance. In addition to having some cool effects like the particle verb that you can stack with a regular reverb. If you use multiple blocks, get some really nice, ambient or clean guitar tones out of it. So definitely the winner there. But second place is once again Pod 2.0. So, if you're a mainly clean guitarist and you want authentic kind of clean sounds with the ability to go nuts on reverb, the HD is really looking like your pick. So now I've compared all the effects that I personally value as the make or break options when it comes to amp modelers. I'll let you make your decision on which one you like for each. But for this next section, I want to dial in what I find to be my preferred 6-string and 8-string tone out of each modeler. Now, this is where I got to break the rules a little bit in that for the 6 strings, I can pretty much do everything I want under the hood. But when it comes to 8 strings, you gotta add something to the 2.0. You simply cannot throw a F standard tuned 8-string through that and expect to get anything but mud. So I actually did use a Boss GE7. The curve looked more something like this to roll off the low end and boost the Pod 2.0. Otherwise, for the X3 and HD, I just used the built-in stomp box and EQ options that was available. Generally, my signal chain will look something like a gate into a boost, into the high gain amp and cab of choice, and maybe a touch of post EQ. But otherwise, a pretty straightforward signal chain, and basically the same thing on the 6-string sounds. Although I won't be using an overdrive on 2.0, I might do a little bit of pre-EQ tweaking on these. As much as I hate to say it, HD took that one by a long shot. For the 6-string sound, this wasn't necessarily my ideal tone, but it was far closer than the other two. The X3 was far too digital sounding. It didn't have the real attack of any kind of tube amp that I would normally play through. The 2.0, it really needs some outboard gear to be as articulate as I want it to be. So that adds inconvenience and cost, not to mention the cab models, the microphone models, all the post EQ options. You can really fine tweak your sound on here and make otherwise kind of mostly samey sounding high gain amps that much more different, which is very, very useful considering how few they actually ship with this thing. For the 8-string, a little less cut and dry. There were things that I did like on the X3, but ultimately I would still have to give it to the HD because it sounds a little more real. And because just like with X3, you can mix multiple amplifiers and kind of dial out the things that aren't so good on both of them. And it is easier to do in one preset versus doing it on the X3 where you've got to use this tone 1 and 2 option. And the 2.0, I mean, E for effort, I guess. It's not great. If you throw an ample amount of post EQ on it, I actually find it's a cool sound and it does work. But what's in the box, plus having to pair it with an external EQ or boost pedal, yeah, it's time's pretty much up, I think, in terms of extended range guitar work. But yeah, I wasn't too surprised by that. But I was kind of expecting the X3 to maybe pull out ahead on those. But nope, as it turns out, newer is actually better for my personal tones. Now, let's get into something that I think isn't going to be such a common use case for any of these products, but especially the older ones. But it's something that I wanted to validate to see if there was merit to it. As I've said many times throughout this video and all the videos concerning these pods, I think the cab models are generally the weakest link on all of the generations. So what a lot of people suggest doing is either post-EQing it or throwing an entirely different cab model on altogether. Now, you can't load impulse responses into any of this, which I think is ridiculous on the HD especially. Totally excusable on those two. So in an attempt to freshen up the pod sound, I'm going to disable the onboard cab modeling and put it through an external own hammer impulse response. Unfortunately, it's not quite that easy on all the units, as the HD is the only one that has the preamp and power amp sim all wrapped up in their little amp model. The X3 technically has some power amp coloration, but barely, and the 2.0 for all intents and purposes is basically a preamp going through a specifically EQ'd cab model. So in order to liven up the power section a bit, I'm actually going to enable the TPA1 by Ignite amps on both of these to maybe give it a little bit of power tube coloration. So let's see if our efforts were worthwhile. Now that's a pretty sizable improvement across the board, especially on these older models. And there is something to be said for not having to use those plugins, and I personally preferred the sound of the HD because it was paired properly with the power amp, though it was dialed in too dark compared to the other two. You could fix that, of course, but really nice improvements out of both the X3 and 2.0. So I could see if you had a particular amplifier model or effect model that you liked on these older pods and you still wanted to preserve that but make it a bit more realistic sounding in terms of sitting in the mix, then I think it'd be a great option for using the external impulse response use case. For the HD, it does make sense, and actually makes more sense since the said sense way too many times there. But you have the power amp and preamp are already tied together, so it is a bit more convenient in that way. But you know, at the same time, you have to step back and think, if I'm going to go through all this trouble anyway, maybe I should just use VST plugins and be done with it. So it's really going to depend on your use case. So if there's a particular pod sound you really like, this proves that it's kind of worthwhile to go down that route and try out different impulse responses. The problem you'll run into is if you're trying to reproduce this live, you're going to have other outboard gear to do that, whether it be a pair of Moore radars, unless you're running mono, or no, there is a couple stereo loaders out there, some other gear that's worth way more than any of this stuff is combined today. So that's the thing you'll run into. Now let's go on the very last test. This is a edge use case at best, but it is one that some people used to run, and I think some people will still continue to do so, but I think it's a bit more popular with more realistic amp modelers nowadays, where you'll take something like this, run it into a powered cabinet, whether it be its own, standalone thing, or more commonly, say like a solid state power amp, flat power amp going into a 4x12 or maybe a tube power amp. So we're going to try both of those use cases, and things start to get a little convoluted here once again. Our first round of tests will once again disable the cab models on all the pods and put them through a Matrix GT 1000 effects. That is a flat, solid state, neutral power amp that's generally meant to be paired with modelers that already have a power amp sound to them. So think Axe FX, think Helix. And then we'll put that through a oversized Mesa Boogie 4x12 mic'd up with a single SM7B. We're going for consistency here, not necessarily the absolute best sound ever. And then we're going to take same setup and then put it through the effects return of this Mesa Boogie single rectifier for a 6L6 tube sound. I'm going to have that on the red modern channel with the presence turned all the way to the bottom. That way it gives a consistent negative feedback and you don't have to worry about that. The setup's going to change a bit for each one though. So first of all, we're going to have the power amp and cab tuning option A turned on the 2.0 and X3, which basically adds just a slight EQ curve for it to play nicer with effects returns and 4x12s, supposedly. There's really not that big of a difference in my opinion, but you can hear it in the room at least. Now with the HD, I did set it to the amp mode. However, when we're putting it through the flat power amp, I'm going to keep the amp modeling completely on, so power amp and all, because that's kind of what the solid state power amp's meant for. However, when we put it through the effects return, I'm going to go to the pre-model, turning off the power amp sim and letting the tube power amp here do the work. That's a lot to take in, but hopefully it will make sense when you see the B-roll and hear what's happening. First of all, wow, did these two sound humongous compared to their direct equivalents. And it makes sense. And the first person that comes to mind with this setup is John Brown of Monuments, who used to use an XT Pro exclusively pretty much through a Marshall stereo power amp and then a 4x12. And as he put it, you know, this is an all digital thing and there's not really much power amp modeling going on like on newer amplifier modelers. So it makes sense that you put it through real tubes, real moving speakers, and you get something that sounds far more realistic. And in fact, you know, if you hadn't told me that was an amp modeler, I probably wouldn't, that wouldn't have been my first thought. I've been like, yeah, there's something I'd dial differently in there, but I wouldn't have thought that, oh, it's a 2.0 going through a tube power amp. So very good sound. And again, it's one of those things that may not make financial sense compared to the cost of these, but if you are running a Pro or you're running a floorboard and you gig a lot, then, you know, maybe you can find a cheap cabinet and a cheap power amp, specifically tube power amp for these guys, and make it come to life. And then you basically got your pedal board and preamp stuff on one package. That's cool. On the flip side, because there was such an improvement with the tubes, solid state power amp sucks shit for these. And it makes complete sense again, because this is not what the, you know, that use case was intended for. The Matrix is meant for things that have everything modeled sans the cab. That's it. Although the Matrix power amps are designed to kind of interact with the speakers in the same way that a tube power amp would in terms of the push-pull and all that good stuff, it's not resonating in the same way. It's not, certainly not EQ'd in the same way that a tube power amp naturally is. So you're missing all of that when it comes to the X3 and 2.0. So I can't really recommend to run these through solid state power amps unless you add some really heavy post EQ on it for the best results. Now with the HD, kind of up in the air. I personally prefer to just keep the cab or the power amp modeling rather on and then put it through the solid state thing. It's not as convincing as an Axe effects through it, but I think once again the power amps kind of play nice with the internal models, and it's better than putting it through an effects return. Certainly simpler. You don't have to worry about as many things on your preset. You know, if you got a preset at home that works, just turn off the cab, put it through a solid state power amp, you're done. Certainly sounded good. I don't like a lot of the pre's on here though. There's something, I don't know, weird. I just don't care for the way they sit. Sometimes even the gain structure doesn't sound right. There's something going on there as well. So for the simplicity, and because you have so many EQ options to tweak anyway, you can kind of put this through a shitty solid state power amp and still probably get a decent tone. So that would be my setup if I were to use that, which is a good thing because if you're going to buy an HD, even today, you're going to be spending a little bit more money. So you can save a few bucks on the power amp and cab setup. And with that, we are finally nearing the end of this video. This turned into a bigger beast than even I intended. I know I make long format gear documentaries, but this one was a bitch, and the worst is ahead of me. I've not edited this yet, so I'm not going to breathe a sigh of relief yet. But for fun, I tallied up all the scores. So I ranked each test and each pod 1 through 3, 1 being my favorite, 3 being the least favorite. Some of them tied for first, some of them tied for second, whatever. But in general, it was a pretty straightforward 1, 2, 3 operation. And then I averaged out the scores. I didn't do any special weights. I just decided, you know what, these are all equally important to me. So if I don't count the amps that aren't on the pod 2.0, I end up liking the HD significantly better than both, with a 40% and 45% deficit respectively on the X3 and 2.0. So HD definitely hit it out of the park with that. Now, if I do consider the amps that the X3 includes, as well as the ones that you have to buy on HD, the gap closes a bit on the X3 with only a 26% deficit. And because this took a fat loss on all of those, it widens up to 53%. So as an actual recording and playing tool, HD wins this shootout for me. Based on this. This is not a holistic way to score this, mind you. I still have plenty of problems with this thing. And, you know, furthermore, I think by the time this came out, this whole pod bean form factor is just stupid. It does not make any sense. This is almost a perfect product as far as I'm concerned. It's so simple to use. Everything's basically right there, at least on the 2.0. It doesn't show, you know, necessarily which amp model 17 through 32 are, but I don't care. It's so easy to use. With this, you're going through menus. Half the knobs don't do shit unless you're on the right spot. They wanted you to use this as an acoustic or vocal thing too. Keep it simple, stupid. Like, let's just be able to play guitar through it. So there are definitely problems with this, but in terms of overall functionality, overall tones, I'd have to give the win to the HD. And I think I could recommend the floorboards or even the Pro a lot higher than I could with this, having never touched them, simply because of the problems that you have with this form factor. Now, there's a gazillion more things I could talk about on this topic and more, ranging from the state of the industry, how this reflects it, what I've learned, Line 6 as a whole, but I'm going to save that for a future video because this has been way too long as is. But hopefully this is like the shotgun approach to all the information anyone would ever want to know, so skip around at your leisure. But what I will say is I'm not keeping all 3 of these. I will be keeping this. I just really like the original. It sucks in so many ways, but it's a good kind of suck. Whereas I can't justify keeping both of these. They are way too similar, but at the same time, there's aspects of each that I prefer over the other one. So I don't know which one that'll be yet. I'll probably end up going through this data one more time and making my assertion that way, but you know, there's like a cover or two I'd like to use with this, since some artists did use this that I like, but there's so many things I like about this better as a just actual plug-in and play device, and I kind of would like to keep one for travel and just to have 2 gens of pods, you know, because I'm a hoarder, I guess. I either have Stockholm Syndrome with pods or something far worse. I'm not quite sure yet, but I guess that will conclude this shootout. And with the end of this video, I think I'm going to officially, non-officially call this the end of Season 1 of Pedalhead. This has been a really shootout-focused thing, some of which, you know, more apples to apples than others, but that's been really the format of the show. What I'd like to do going forward is have more of a mixture. I'd like to have kind of a deep dive on single pedals that I think are worthwhile going over, that I can't necessarily review because they're not new, or they are good pedals and they're an obvious recommendation to some people, but I really want to deep dive and show what makes them special. And then there will be opportunities for shootouts like this, but I think this is not a sustainable thing as just shootouts all the time. Maybe each season or mid-season finale, whatever I classify that as, we'll do something like that when it makes sense. But yeah, next pedal head, I would expect to see some more in-depth action on one product rather than a larger take on all of them. And that's about that. I'm probably going to take a day off or two from this channel after this and work on some more of my music, because this was it was a bitch, but it was fun. So hopefully you learned as much as I did, and we will see you next time. Thanks for watching. Bye.